Self-consciousness exists in and for itself when and by the fact that it so exists for another. That is, it exists only in being acknowledged. The notion of this, its unity in its duplication, embraces many and varied meanings. Its moments, then, must on the one hand be strictly apart, and on the other hand must in this differentiation at the same time also be taken and known as not distinct or in their opposite significance. The twofold significance of the distinct moments has in the nature of self-consciousness to be infinite, or directly the opposite of the determinateness in which it is posited. The detailed exposition of the notion of this spiritual unity in its duplication will present us with the process of recognition. We've now arrived at paragraph 178, one that I know that you've been looking forward to, all of you viewers, in part because it's a turning point for Hegel's phenomenology. And what we're going into is the section that has been most often looked at in isolation from the other parts of the phenomenology. What I'm going to try to do as we go through this is to keep on reconnecting it to the rest of the phenomenology, because I think that's very important. So what section are we talking about here? It's translated in your Miller translation as Lordship and Bondage. That's a common English rendering for Herrschaft and Knechthaft. Master and slave, the master-slave dialectic is just as good. We don't need to quibble about which of these terms is the closer to the German, because the answer is really they're both. You know, this is something that has been talked about so much in Hegel literature, and both sets of terms have been used, you know, pretty extensively. So you don't have to feel as if you have to stick with one or the other. And I'm going to go back and forth myself, most likely, as we do this. Now you notice that I've got this first passage sort of charted out with a bit of the German thrown in there that, you know, is worth, you know, commenting on and thinking about. This first sentence is very important, and so we're going to look at that closely and then talk about what's going on in the rest of this paragraph. This really sets the agenda for what is to come throughout the entire section, because there's a key term here that Hegel is bringing up, and that is recognized, recognition, anerkennen. This is what the master and the slave, what the two self-consciousnesses are striving for across this entire dynamic that's developing between the two of them. And it's something that's going to continue throughout the relationship of individual self-consciousness or individual self-consciousness within the realm of spirit with other self-consciousnesses. We're not actually going to get to some sort of complete recognition until the very end of the phenomenology, when we go past religion and we get into absolute knowing and we talk about the spiritual community. But it's something that is at the core of human desire. You remember how important desire was for self-consciousness, Begierde, hunger, desire, what it is that we're seeking, you know, craving. What it is that we're really craving deep down inside, according to Hegel, besides food and drink and security and things like that, is recognition by another. Recognition that we can not just enjoy for a fleeting moment, but which we can take as something stable, as in fact something that we can be certain of. You know, we want the truth and the certainty, as always, of recognition. So Hegel is going to say self-consciousness is, and your book has exists, the German is just ist, so either one is fine, is in itself and for itself, right? And this is something that we've been looking for throughout the entire development in the earlier dynamics, something that is both in itself and for itself. This is going to take on a very important role. Can the self-consciousness remain in itself and for itself the entire time? Not as we're going to see it happening, but that's what it's always striving for. So it's in itself and for itself. There he's got two terms that are translated here as when and by the fact. And so indem and dadurch, right? When, not as in the temporal sense, but rather as sort of, you know, this is the qualifier. This says what the conditions need to be. And then dadurch, through. through the fact that, by the fact, through the condition that. And what is going on here? What are these qualifying things? It's in itself and for itself when it is in itself and for itself, here's the key thing, for another. If I wanted to joke a little bit here, the solipsist or the narcissist can't be a good Hegelian, right? Because they don't have another to engage with. But, you might say, well, they don't have another to engage with precisely because they realize that others are so unreliable and you can't predict what they're going to do because they are also autonomous self-consciousnesses. You can't coerce them into just being, accoutrements to your own little world. If you do that, you lose out on it. We're going to see how that dynamic plays out. But in itself and for itself, for another. The way that he talks about this then is when and through the fact that it is recognized. Als anerkanntes, as one who is recognized. Recognized by who? You might say, well, just by another, right? But also, recognition for oneself, as we're going to see, is indeed mediated through the other. And you might say, well, who's this other? There's a whole world of others out there, and, one other is different than another other, and here's what's really interesting about it. The world doesn't center upon me, and it doesn't center on any of those other others either. It may temporarily seem to do so, but it doesn't, in fact. And where the entire Hegelian movement is going towards the end is having this whole expanse of self-consciousnesses who are related to each other. They're connected, and you might say a whole web that goes all the way back into human history and proceeds, further into the future. In which no single one individual is absolutely transcendent precisely because every individual is indeed recognized. But that's, again, further down the line. So let's continue with this. If we get past that first sentence, here he talks about how we have to make sense of this. And here he's giving us not some, the schema is not sort of a general resolution of the matter, but rather, you might say, some guidance about where we're going to go and how we're going to get there. So he says, the notion of this, its unity and its duplication, embraces many and varied meanings, right? This is going to take place through a whole bunch of different shapes of consciousness, as we're going to see running throughout the rest of the text. Not just the master-slave dialectic, by the way. The master-slave dialectic, it's at the beginning, it's very important, but he's not saying this is the pattern for all human interaction, as some people have taken him to be saying. Its moments, then, must on the one hand be held strictly apart, right? The moments are separated from each other. What are the moments? The individual self-consciousnesses and what is going on in their development. They have to be held apart from each other. And yet, on the other hand, must in this differentiation at the same time also be taken and known as not distinct. So in their differentiation, in their Unterscheidung, they're being splitting apart, right? As not distinct, not unterscheidet, right? Not split apart from each other. These are, he says, opposed, these significances. Entgegengesetzte Bedeutung. Opposed, set apart from each other meanings, right? This has to be taken in an opposite meaning from that. So he says the twofold significance of the distinct moments has in the nature of self-consciousness to be infinite. This whole thing is going on within self-consciousness, and self-consciousness is infinite, in part by not being able to be entirely what it is, like a sort of closed-in upon itself sphere. To be self-conscious, we saw before with the earlier part of this section, involves this reflexivity. You can look at yourself, right? You can take a stance upon yourself. But it also does so precisely by its relation to another. And we saw that the most interesting other is not the plant, is not the external world, is not the landscape, is not the animal even. It's the other self-consciousness that can in some way make itself an object for us, and which, as we're going to see, can objectify us as well. That is what is there in the infinity of self-consciousness. So he says, he goes on and he says, the detailed exposition of the notion of the spiritual unity in its duplication will present us with the process of recognition. That's what we're up to in the rest of this section. Self-consciousness is faced by another self-consciousness. It has come out of itself. This has a twofold significance. First, it has lost itself, for it finds itself as an other being. Secondly, in doing so, it has superseded the other, for it does not see the other as an essential being, but in the other sees its own self. Like many of the shorter paragraphs that we've seen leading up to this point, paragraph 179 has one central idea that is worth exploring. We don't have to go into great depth about it because its exploration is going to happen in the paragraphs that follow, but it is worth stressing this point. So Hegel says what we have now is a self-consciousness that has gone outside of itself. It is now in the world, so to speak, at the very least outside of its own head, we might say, outside of its own boundedness of its own heart, its affect, and it is connected with an other. But this other is also a self-consciousness. So he says it's faced by another self-consciousness, and he says this has a twofold significance. We're going to see this twofold coming up quite a bit, especially in the paragraphs that follow right after this, where Hegel's going to talk about ambiguity. And what is the twofold significance at this point? There's a sort of, I don't want to say bifurcation, but rather a mixing together of two different experiences, two different attitudes. And both of these are going on at the same time in the relation to the other self-consciousness. So self-consciousness desires ultimately to be recognized by this other self-consciousness and thereby to recognize itself. What happens, Hegel says, well, let's go directly to the text here. He says, it has lost itself. Self-consciousness has lost itself in the other. Why? It finds itself as another being. By seeing the self-consciousness, by seeing itself over there, the other has, you might say, in a certain sense, appropriated, without even meaning to do so, the identity or the essence of the itself over here. Remember, self-consciousness, right, is a relation, a reflexive relation with itself. And so, when I think about who I am, and what my importance is, and how I matter, what it is that I am down at the core, I can have these experiences where I discover I'm not so special. That, here would be a great example. I go to a club because I want to find other people who share my particular interest. And before I enter into that door, I am the guy who does this. I am the guy who is interested in this. I am the guy who can talk about that. Then I get to the club and I find somebody else and I can talk back and forth with them and I have that moment of recognition where, oh, it's so great to actually have somebody who is interested in medieval history. And then it turns out that they know a lot more about medieval history than I do. And suddenly the weight has gone over to that side. Or they don't even need necessarily to know more. They just need to know a bit more, or even the same as I do. This is just one example out of so many that we could use. Now, at the same time, in addition to this loss, we also have something like a supersession, an Aufhebung of the other self-consciousness. He says, in doing so, it has superseded the other, for it does not see the other as an essential being, but in the other sees its own self. So there's this double-sidedness to seeing the self in the other, whether the other is a rival, whether the other is a friend, whether the other is a lover, whether the other is a teacher. We could pick whatever role we want. This duality is inhabiting it in the relation of self-consciousness to another self-consciousness. it must supersede this otherness of itself. This is the supersession of the first ambiguity, and is therefore itself a second ambiguity. First, it must proceed to supersede the other independent being in order thereby to become certain of itself as the essential being. Secondly, in so doing, it proceeds to supersede its own self, for this other is itself. There's two key terms here in section 80 that are being used in a way almost correlative to each other, and I suppose it's a little bit funny that we're talking about twos here because one of those very terms has the whole sense of duality built within it, and that is this ambiguity, right? When we have an ambiguity, or in German, a Doppelsinn, double sense, double meaning, what we've got going on is one thing that it can be interpreted in multiple ways. Here Hegel's thinking in terms of two ways, but true ambiguity, things could be all over the place. Like the word seal, for example. Is it the rock singer? Is it the animal? Is it the thing that you have to seal something up? Is it the action? That's an ambiguous, someone might say, an equivocal term. And if we're using it in a situation in which it could be interpreted multiple ways, in which we're not getting enough context cues, then we have ambiguity there. And oftentimes ambiguity is unavoidable, as in this entire case. We saw that the first ambiguity has to do with the fact that the other self-consciousness is the other of the self, so that, going back to the previous paragraph, if it's regarded as an independent being, what does that mean for self-consciousness? A loss of itself in the other. The other takes on you might say, the pull of essentiality in this dyadic relationship. On the other hand, insofar as the other can be seen as just another self, as being the same as the self, it becomes an unessential being, because I'm seeing that other self over there, and I'm the one who's seeing it. So I'm the essential being. And that is what Hegel calls the first supersession. He just called it the supersession in the previous paragraph, but now he's calling it the first because he's talking about two of them. So the first supersession has to do with this first ambiguity. The fact that I can see the other as another of me, as myself being there in the other, as the similarity between us in two different ways, two distinct ways that cannot be separated apart from each other. I'm stuck sort of feeling these and living through these both at the same time. That's why the other ends up being the other to me. That's part of the experience of the other. So then he goes on and he says, self-consciousness must supersede this otherness of itself. What is superseding this otherness of itself? Well, that's this supersession here, the supersession of the first ambiguity. Therefore, itself becomes a second ambiguity connected with a second supersession. A supersession of the supersession, going up to yet a higher level. It's happening very quickly here, isn't it? So he says, it must proceed to supersede the other independent being in order to become certain of itself as the essential being. In doing so, here's the second supersession, it proceeds to supersede its own self, because when it's superseding the other is its own self. If I am superseding the other who I am sort of threatened by, or I don't want to become the essential one, I've asserted myself against that person, I am actually doing something to myself over there in that other person at the same time. It was the fact that I am over there which meant that the other could become the essential one, which then, gave me some sort of anxiety or troubling or whatever that led me to supersede them. But that itself ends up superseding me in the process. So there's a double ambiguity here, Hegel says. There's two different ambiguities. There's an ambiguity of ambiguity, if you like that, if you want to, play around with that idea a bit. And that is something that is integral to the relation to the other self-consciousness. This ambiguous supersession of its ambiguous otherness is equally an ambiguous return into itself. For first, through the supersession, it receives back its own self, because by superseding its otherness, it again becomes equal to itself. But secondly, the other self-consciousness equally gives it back again to itself, for it saw itself in the other, but supersedes this being of itself in the other, and thus lets the other again go free. Paragraph 181 begins with a very difficult and confusing sentence which invokes ambiguity 3 different times. And so it is very important to understand what's going on here. I wanted to chart it out for you so you can see exactly what Hegel's talking about. You have to think back to the previous paragraphs that we've just gone over for the referent points about what the ambiguity constitutes. Notice I didn't say reference points, I said referent, because we're thinking about what we're referring to, right? The referent of that. And let's just read through the sentence and then I'll lead you through it. So he says, this ambiguous supersession, right, of its ambiguous otherness is equally an ambiguous return into itself. So we've got 3 different ambiguities, seemingly. 2 of the ambiguities are actually sides of the same thing. When we talk about the ambiguous supersession, in the past paragraph, we talked about 2 supersessions, which are actually the same supersession, but you can look at them in different ways. The first and the second, that is the ambiguity that we're talking about there in the ambiguous supersession. Over here on this side, ambiguous otherness. What did we mean by that? Well, ambiguous otherness meant that I am finding myself in the other as self-consciousness, because the other has, as self-consciousness, a similar structure to myself. And we saw that I can be losing myself in the other self-consciousness, or I can sort of regain myself by superseding them. So the first supersession is of the other as other, the other that is sort of taken over the center of importance. The other has become the center point of the world, and I take that back from them so I can have it myself. But then the joke's on me, because as it turns out, I'm over there in the other, and in superseding the other, precisely because I'm superseding the other, because there's a risk to me by the fact that I'm over there, I'm superseding myself in the other. And so, in a way, I win by losing, and I lose by winning. There's a really interesting, switch between polarities here that we're going to see play itself out as we move into other paragraphs. So far, so good, right? We have an ambiguous supersession. We now know what the ambiguity is of ambiguous otherness. We now know what that ambiguity is. So he says, this leads to an ambiguous return into itself. This whole thing here. All right, so what is this ambiguous return into itself? That's the rest of this paragraph. There's 2 sides to it, right? When we see ambiguity for Hegel, we should think, okay, we're looking for 2 things going on at the same time, 2 different interpretations that are in a certain sense harmonious, but also jarring with each other. What are they? So self-consciousness receives back its own self, he says, in this supersession. Why? It supersedes the otherness, right? And it thereby becomes equal to itself again, which is part of what it was looking for. Self-consciousness is looking for self-certainty. And it has self-certainty by knowing what, in fact, it is, right? By being able to say, I am this. Turns out, unfortunately, that tends to be rather contentless and doesn't satisfy us for very, very long. That's going to be an issue, right? It also receives itself from the other self-consciousness. Hegel talks about the other self-consciousness giving here. So he says, secondly, the other self-consciousness equally gives it back again to itself. Gives self-consciousness itself back to itself. So the other is playing an active role here, something that I can't myself control, something that I can't, in a certain sense, predict even, Precisely because it is another self-consciousness. So this is where we're talking about recognition, right? Recognition cannot be ultimately coerced. Not if you want real recognition. I forgot an S here. So it receives itself from the other self-consciousness who is giving it. Why? Because it superseded the being of itself in the other. That was the second supersession, right, in the ambiguity there. What Hegel says is this means that it lets the other go free. This is very momentous. This is a very important point. The other, as a self-consciousness, is going to be free, and that sounds really great. Oh, freedom is wonderful for everybody, until you see how people actually use their freedom, and you start thinking about, well, what the hell are they going to do with it? You know, I might do this or that. Well, they might do something even crazier than me. So the other going free is, in a certain sense, an achievement, but it's also going to lead to what we're going to see happen in the next several paragraphs.